Welcome to topic 2 in our subject, Intelligence and Analytics. In this topic, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview and some signposts on the kinds of data that's available and that's out there, and also a little bit on how data is collected. Now, it's not an exhaustive overview, but rather an opportunity for me to point out a few key areas of interest. I'm really relying on you using not only the learning materials through these PowerPoint slides and my short presentations, but also the required and recommended readings, as well as the few of those YouTube clips and additional sources and readings that I encourage you to look at as well. It'll just provide you with more of a holistic approach to it. So, as I said, in this topic, we look at the kinds of data that is used, and we'll look at how that type of data is collected. And in doing so, we've come across some key themes about what this topic covers. And I guess the first thing I'd like us to do is to think about data in general. How do we think about it? We'll talk more in detail, but for the most part, I think when we hear the word data, we tend to naturally think of computers and ones and zeros. But data is more than that. And I think it's important that when we talk about data, particularly with intelligence gathering, is that it's a range of things. It's not just a technological thing. Another theme is how do we classify data? So what are some ways that we can identify data at various different stages? And we'll talk about some of the different stages of data as we find it and so forth. And then I want to talk a little bit about the way that data fits with the intelligence cycle, just to get an idea of where some of the data that we get and some of the data we're using, where it might fit in if we were to be assessing it or looking at it as per the intelligence cycle. And finally, another area that we're going to cover, a theme, is how ways that data is collected. Now, I've provided a few examples, but it's by no means an exhaustive list of examples of ways that data is collected, rather just some various different approaches that we've come across. So there's some of the themes that we'll talk about in this particular topic. So when we think about data, as I said, we tend to think of data as being mostly an information thing, a computer thing, but it's a lot more. In fact, data, as my little thought bubble there shows, is everything and it's everywhere. It's the array of information that comes about through our observations of things, so whether it be observations of people, organisations, even in the natural sciences, observing and writing down your observations is a form of data. Data is also just generally information we find. So whether it's on the internet, on a Facebook site, or whether it's a pamphlet or a poster, again, that's forms of data. It can also even be the conversations that we hear. And it can also be books and even reports that we might come across as well. So data is a lot of things, and I know that data for the most part is seen as technology. I mean, there's a lot of issues we spoke about in the previous topic about mega data. We've spoken about big data and the way that data is being captured and analysed by law enforcement and government agencies. We talked about the various ways that applications can track people, can track buying habits, and a whole host of different things. And so we do be mindful of that, and we do, when we think about data, we do also obviously want to think about the technology aspects of it. But I just wanted us to also remember some of the old-fashioned ways that data comes about. So when we think of data, I guess what I'm trying to say is that we need to think about it in all its guises. We need to be able to not just think in a myopic view that it's all about computers or it's all about what's on the internet or information technology. Rather, it's a whole host of different things. And I'm probably labouring this point, but I just wanted to make sure that we get that, sort of get that across. So that's how we think about data. But how do we go about classifying it? Now, data traditionally can be classified into at least 3 sections. Commonly known as raw data, and I think those of you doing operational intelligence would have come across the idea of raw intelligence. Raw data is somewhat similar in that it's data that's collected from a source, but it hasn't been evaluated. It hasn't been analysed, and it hasn't even been structured into any way that we could begin to analyse it. So as I've got some examples here, it could be a simple tally of traffic along your particular street. Someone's just counted traffic, counted all the red cars or so forth. It's just data, numbers, and it's raw because it hasn't been analysed, nor has it been processed or exploited, which we'll come to in a moment. So for us, raw data, again, could even be a call history on a mobile phone, any number of things, but the key thing, what makes it raw data, is that it hasn't been manipulated or exploited in any way, and it certainly hasn't been analysed to a production standard. And they're the next 2 classifications of data that we'll look at as well. So when we talk about exploited data, that's data that it's been processed and undergone some analysis. The process phase of transforming raw data into exploited data usually begins with organising that data. So putting the data in a way that we can look at it effectively. So this may be putting it into a spreadsheet or using any number of analytical tools to basically lay it out and format it in a way where we can begin to start analysing that data. And so it's about putting structures in. And so once you put those structures in, the exploited data then is able to begin, we can begin analysing that data. Now, you'll note here in the PowerPoint, I've also made the point, as in the Interact side as well, that exploited data will also remove any sort of problems, any anomalies or any things that aren't quite right within that. So it's going through and sorting it and getting it into a format that can be analysed. And so the final way that data can be classified out of the 3 categories is the production data. Production data is often the data that's used in your intelligence product, so your briefing or your report. And very often it's at this point that the data that's been gathered is being analysed and presented to address a specific intelligence requirement or directive that you get. So if you were looking at an operational intelligence type of approach, whatever the objectives of that, the data production, the production data that you present is going to be addressing that, or in other cases it'll address trying to answer a particular type of hypothesis or any number of questions that may have been asked. So they often also will then lead towards some sort of recommendation or so forth. So it's the polished, the data that's polished, it's the data that's analysed, and it's the data that you use to present in your intelligence product, your report and so forth. Now they're just 3 ways that data can be classified, and the ways that we can identify different types of data. And by knowing the different classifications, we're able to then apply some thought to, or some credibility, and some thought to the accuracy of that data as well. Now, within those various stages, the raw, the exploited, and the final product, we can sort of in a way fit them into the intelligence cycle. Now we talked about that if you look here with the first stage, which is the direction, the requirements, okay? The next stage here is the collection, and it's at this first phase here that we would see and gather raw data. or data that is yet to be analysed. Now, this is no hard and fast rule, but if it helps, it's a way of sort of thinking about how data can fit into the intelligence cycle. So here in the first stage, we can probably see raw data being collected. In the third phase, the processing of data, is that second stage of the exploitation of the data. That's the second category that we spoke about. So it's at this point that the data becomes exploited, it becomes processed, put into a form that's easy enough for us to understand and to try and begin the analysis process. And then the analysis phase, the fourth phase, and also maybe into the fifth phase as well, is where we have that produced intelligence. So the intelligence in its final stage, its polished stage. And so in some ways, I bring this up just again so you get a sense of how data does fit into that intelligence cycle. And you'll notice throughout this subject that we will come back to this cycle just again to give it what we're doing, a bit of context and so forth as well. So that's some ways that data fits into the intelligence cycle, and also a way that we can see where those different categories of data, the raw data, the processed data and the product data, all fit within the intelligence cycle. Now, I want to move to the way that data is collected. You'll note that data is collected from a range of sources. And those sources, or the choice of the data that we collect, is going to be informed by a collection plan. Now, a collection plan is exactly what it sounds like. It's a plan of what information, what data do we need to answer or meet the operational objectives or answer a particular research question. So a plan is what information, what data do we need. And so how we collect data will be discovered and worked out through drafting a collections plan. And obviously the collection plan is going to be informed by those intelligence requirements or the directive that you've been given to find information. Now, data is collected from a range of sources, and I've gone ahead here and I've just put a couple of types of sources. And this comes in part from the text, the Handbook on Scientific Methods for Intelligence Analysis, and I've got some chapters there on the Interact site that I recommend you read in regards to this. But I've chosen 4 here just out of interest to give you a sense of some of the way that sources are categorised. By no means it's not all of them. So I've got here we've got open source intelligence, we've got semi-open source, clandestine sources and covert sources. And I thought we'd just highlight these, just that they're nice, interesting ones. Open source is really coming to the forefront in intelligence gathering, although I think it's always been there, but maybe it hasn't quite had the name attached to it. Now, we probably already know this, but just to recap, open source data is basically data that's available to the public. So it can be found in media reports, websites, ABS statistics, libraries. It could even be in published public company reports or even government reports. And there's no restrictions on obtaining open source data. It's all out there, anyone can get it, anyone can put it together, and anyone can certainly analyse it. And some will tell you, and it's probably correct, that even most intelligence agencies, most of their data comes from open sources. In fact, very little would come from the clandestine or their covert sources, some will say. So open source and the ability to use open source as a way to collect data is an important part of the overall business. And I've put on the Interact site an interesting YouTube clip where someone's done a bit of open source. It's a bit of tongue-in-cheek, but you might find it of interest. So open source is one way that we collect data. Another way we might collect data is through what we call semi-open source. Now, semi-open source is data that can publicly be obtained, but not quite as easily as perhaps open source. So for example, you may need to file an application. In many cases, it could be a freedom of information application. It can also, though, include things like internal documents that aren't really classified, but also aren't distributed widely either. It may also include some military documents that are unclassified, or even still, it could be the unpublished works from an academic or a specialist in a particular field. And in some cases, it may even stretch to conversations with government officials or researchers and so forth. So it's not necessarily out there, but it can be found with relatively ease and with a bit of application. So that's where some data can be obtained from that semi-open source. Now, the more mysterious aspects of data collection can be seen in these final two examples, where we look at the clandestine sources and covert sources. Some people use these two interchangeably, and yet there are some distinct differences. Clandestine data involves collecting information, collecting data, but the operative who's collecting it will be probably visible to the person, to the target they're getting it off, but they're disguised. So the target doesn't know exactly who they really are. They could be posing as being someone else. And so it likely will involve a degree of deception, a degree of secrecy, and almost always obtained without the source aware that they're actually providing data to that operative. And so that the data obtained through clandestine methods can be of real value because they provide, I guess, real insights into what's going on. And in some cases, they can provide in-sources that things like open intelligence or even open sources could never provide. So there's a role for that. The other one down the bottom here, in terms of the ways data is collected, is through covert sources. So covert data, similar, as I said, to clandestine, but often the operative won't be disguised and in plain sight of the target, so there's not that sort of deception involved. Rather, the covert source data is often taken without the target's knowledge. And at times that covert data can be obtained through physical, optical or even audio surveillance methods. And while surveillance can provide some important data, it's usually best used when it informs other data that you get as well. So in some ways, and we do come to this in the second part of this topic where we look at fusion, data fusion and so forth, we'll see that sometimes you need a range of different datas to provide that particular that picture that we overall need. So there's some ways, just some ways that data can be collected. Now, I've included these readings here, and I've deliberately wanted these to be a little bit different to the topic that I guess the main things that I've covered in this overview, in that it looks a little bit more at the technical side of things, of data mining and some analysis stuff. It looks at the place of data as a surveillance and undertakes that sense of trying to introduce, I guess, the ethics of that. And we've talked about the ideas of people monitoring your browser habits, your shopping habits, your locations. So we talk a little bit about how data can be a way of conducting surveillance on individuals as well. So I encourage you to look at that. Please look at the social media intelligence. This is a rising field, and I'm hoping that we'll talk more about this throughout the subject. But social media, particularly in the private sector, is used heavily to surveil individuals and targets and so forth. And so it's worthwhile having a look at that. And if you're not too familiar with social media intelligence, I'd really advise you to have a look. I think the YouTube clip that I've put on the i2 site also has a look at the way that they've analysed some social media as well. and again, social media in many respects is also open source intelligence, because many people allow anyone to look at their social media sites. So have a look at those particular readings. They should be complementary, but also maybe take the discussion in a slightly different direction, which is fine and good. Before we come to the study section, you'll also notice on the Interact site I've got 3 chapters that I'm recommending that you read, again from the Handbook of Scientific Methods for Inquiry Intelligence Analysis. I think the chapters 7, 8 and 9, but they're certainly on the Interact site for you to go and have a look at. Now, if you're wanting to test what you've learnt through the readings and the Interact site and this short presentation, by all means, have a look at these study questions. You'll see the first one there is really more of in some ways, an ethical question in some respects, and we've certainly got to give the ethics some thought. And then there's some sort of 3 other questions there that really is just to test your ability just to recount particular aspects of the topic. So look, I hope that's provided you with some direction for your study. And by all means, please contact me if you have any further questions.